So if fluoride is fluoride, then what is the difference between sodium fluoride and sodium MFP or monofluorophosphate? Or what's the difference between sodium fluoride and stannous fluoride? More importantly, do you know which might work best for you? Hello, I'm Dr. Rob and accompanied by Tami, of course, and you're listening to the Dental Formulators Playbook.
Yeah. So before I started working with you, I simply thought toothpaste with toothpaste.
Mhm.
I mean, who even looks at the form of fluoride listed on the ingredient panel?
Yeah.
Obviously, there is fluoride versus fluoride-free options, but it's not clear the differences between the different salt forms of fluoride that are out there. So it's important that you shed light on this.
Yeah, will do, because especially although sodium fluoride, stannous fluoride, and sodium monofluorophosphate are the three allowed forms of fluoride in the USA, there are clear differences amongst these.
Okay, so you mentioned NaMFP or sodium monofluorophosphate.
Yep.
That's another one. So we need some clarification and direction.
Yeah, that one isn't really discussed yet, but I really think it needs to be. All right, so let's tackle that versus, for instance, sodium fluoride. So there is a distinct difference between these two, and it's kind of cool. For instance, the sodium monofluorophosphate. So if we use the term NaMFP or sodium monofluorophosphate or just NaMFP or SMFP, all that refers to the sodium monofluorophosphate. So just so for anybody listening, they're like, wait a minute, what is this? They're all the same. It all depends on who you're talking to in the
Okay.
business and how they want to put that out.
Okay.
So, but if we say sodium monofluorophosphate or sodium MFP, we're talking about the same one. Anyway, regardless, that salt form is quite interesting because it relies on plaque constituents or salivary enzymes, including like the salivary alkaline phosphatase, also known as S-alp or sometimes just SALP, in the mouth to cleave the fluoride, fluorine phosphorus bond that exists in that MFP part of that salt form to be able to create the available fluoride. In contrast, sodium fluoride doesn't need any of that. Like it's just like sodium chloride, salt. If you wanted to add salt to your food, sodium fluoride is almost the same thing. It just dissolves if you add that to water. It doesn't require intervention from either microbes that might exist in the plaque or specific acids that might exist in the plaque or even enzymes like this S-alp enzyme, which by the way is traditionally used more or less as like a biomarker for like inflammation and disease, in fact. So, I mean, we have
Okay.
abundant amounts. It can be used as a biomarker. Anyway, that same biomarker is involved in cleaving the MFP bond whenever that toothpaste with that salt is used in the mouth.
Okay, so sounds a little complicated.
Yeah.
I had no idea if I'm understood what you just described.
Yes.
Sodium MFP
Yep.
requires your saliva then to activate
That's
it.
right. Yep.
Okay. So this fluoride salt is kind of like a prebiotic in the sense that if you had no saliva flow, then the MFP bond couldn't break and there would be less fluoride available. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be one way to look at it, you know.
Okay.
There's going to be degrees of that, but that is one way to think about it. Another option, if that bond were to be broken, would be to use like a very strong acid. When I say this, it's like hydrofluoric acid or hydrochloric acid, which you would never want to introduce that into your mouth anyway. So that's off the table. Metals can also hydrolyze, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They can also break that bond, but you don't usually have a lot of metal in the mouth, with the exception of maybe if you have orthodontia or if you have a permanent retainer. Could that metal have some kind of reaction with the MFP? It is possible. Absolutely.
Okay, so what do you mean by hydrolyzing?
Yeah, so hydrolyzing. So, I mean, obviously the word hydro is going to involve water. I think everybody knows that, right? But, more specifically, when we're talking about this from a chemistry perspective, especially from an organic chemistry perspective, that usually means there's a reaction. And the
Okay.
reaction is going to involve water. Sometimes it involves acids, sometimes not. But generally, it's going to sometimes scientists, chemists, sometimes even non-scientists will use this. They will interchangeably use hydrolyze for decomposition or attack. So, what will attack the molecule or what will decompose the molecule, meaning break it into its smaller parts?
Okay, so that's good to know. So if the sodium MFP gets hydrolyzed, then what's the result?
Well, then that's the source of the free fluoride, right? If it comes off.
Okay.
So you have phosphorus and you have a fluorine bond, and there's only one. That's why it's called monofluoro. It's only one of those bonds, but that's the bond that gets broken. Once that breaks, then all of a sudden you have fluoride available to be able to react with the teeth.
Okay, so it's kind of like smart form of fluoride, like kind of an on-demand action, if you will. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, it really is. And it really hasn't been utilized as such, you know? Like it hasn't been even marketed like that, at least more recently. Maybe it had in the past. I don't know. Wasn't around back then. And we'll talk about that in a minute because the provenance goes back way farther than what I think anybody thinks. It is very cool, but you still have to require sufficient plaque constituents, including the microbes, or presence of that salivary enzyme in order for that fluorine phosphorus bond to break. So
Okay.
you can imagine anybody who may not have a lot of these enzymes or may not have a lot of plaque constituents, then there could potentially be a reduction in efficacy because the fluorine is bound up. And, it's not fluoride. Fluoride is the reactive version. Fluorine is the stable version.
So
It's
those with dry mouth might have a bigger problem.
They might have a bigger problem.
Okay.
That's a great point. That's why a lot of the dry mouth formulations, if they have fluoride, it will not be MFP
Okay.
based. It'll be sodium fluoride based. But if somebody wants to know, so, we said, hey, look, how does MFP compare against sodium fluoride? Well, there was a workshop that was convened in the early 90s, actually. And of course, one of my mentors was there, as well as some of the other pioneers and just stalwarts in this field, including Stuckey, as I had mentioned way early on in the early episodes. Featherstone was there. There was several other researchers, and they all wanted to assess whatever clinical studies had been done on the efficacy of sodium fluoride versus MFP based toothpaste.
Okay.
And so they panned the whole literature. And remember, this is before the internet. So you're looking at, this is 1993. They published their results in Carey's research. And so they had to actually go to the journals or, you have to do your research. AI is not going to give you something. It's not available on the internet. Sometimes it's a phone call away, but usually you have to go to the journals. So what they did is they combed the literature and they only accepted for their evaluation to say which one is better or are they both equivalent, They only looked at those studies which had used a proper, and I'm saying this really slowly because I love this, and it's so important, and for the listeners, they have to know too, a placebo dentifrice of the same kind. So you have, MFP dentifrice, if that was involved in the clinical, then it also had a placebo dentifrice. Same exact thing, but it lacked MFP. If it was sodium fluoride, had a sodium fluoride dentifrice that was exactly the same but lacked the sodium fluoride that was used as the placebo.
In other words, well-designed studies.
Yeah, it was a well-designed studies. These were all clinical trials, and they found, well, at that time, so again, this is published in 93, there was only 3 clinicals for sodium fluoride, and there was about 20 for MFP, which sounds crazy. There's a reason for that.
Okay.
But the MFP only gave a 24.4% reduction in caries, while sodium fluoride gave 44% reduction.
So that's a big difference.
It's a big difference.
Wow. Okay, but wait. So this is interesting to me. You said there were only 3 when it came to the sodium fluoride, but there were 20 when it came to the sodium MFP.
Yeah, they weren't trying to selectively slant this towards sodium fluoride. It wasn't that reason. It was because of the provenance of sodium monofluorophosphate, actually. For sodium fluoride, those 3 clinicals were published in 1967, in 1981, and then 1988. For MFP, it ranged the entire decades of the 1960s, the 1970s, and also up until about, I think, 1983 or 1984. Yep.
Okay. I thought that sodium fluoride came way before sodium monofluorophosphate. Is that incorrect?
Yeah, and this is where it's kind of strange. So actually, sodium fluoride or potassium fluoride were already readily available for the dentist. That's what they were administering to children, for instance, whenever they would come for their quarterly or half year visit back in the 1910s, 1920s.
When they would apply it in the office.
Yep. And so they did not have sodium fluoride products for unsupervised at-home use. Remember that was proving way more challenging, and that was really thwarting, and it had to go into because the fluoride wasn't stable. It was being mixed with other ingredients that might reduce efficacy, but they didn't understand that. Right?
Okay. That helps explain why then sodium fluoride then wasn't even used in the dentifrices
That's
because you
right.
said it wasn't stable.
Yeah, they were choosing specific abrasives. So nowadays everybody uses silica abrasive. There's so many different types of silica. You have thickening silica, you have polishing silica, and even in those two categories, you can get different degrees of that. So you can still get cleaning silicas that are going to be for sensitive people versus those that maybe need a little bit more aggressive because they have more staining. Same thing with the thickening. There's so many different properties now, but that is because of the innovations around silica-based abrasives in general. Those are
Okay.
all synthetic. The technology had to catch up. Initially, whenever dentifrices were used, calcium carbonate was one of your primary abrasive
Okay.
systems. Sometimes alumina would be used. And those abrasives are notoriously challenging to work with a sodium fluoride based salt because the fluoride is readily attracted to either the alumina or the calcium from the calcium carbonate abrasive systems. So those were the primary abrasives. Everybody loved to use calcium carbonate. Remember when we talked about the stannous fluoride a long time ago with the whole crest in the 1950s? Remember they had a heat treated
Yeah.
pyrophosphate calcium,
The accident.
yeah, it wasn't a pyrophosphate. It was a calcium phosphate system. It did have some pyrophosphate character, but it was an accident. And when it was just stable enough to go in with stannous fluoride to give at least some kind of clinical evidence after it was made and then sitting on the shelf for a while. It still wasn't the best. Like you couldn't get 2 years shelf life out of that formula. That was not going to be an option, but it was just stable enough. But again, it was a type of calcium based abrasive system that was used.
Okay.
So that's and of course that would be another one. Not only calcium carbonate, but you would also have calcium phosphates. You might even have some pyrophosphates. Usually they would have a calcium character, or you would have alumina as your main abrasives.
Okay. And the reason why you're talking about all of this with the silica and the abrasives and everything is because it then affects the amount of quote unquote free or available fluoride.
Yep.
Because if you reduce that, then you're going to reduce the efficacy, right?
Exactly. So if you couldn't use sodium fluoride and it had to be only in a solution that the clinician would apply in office, then what can you use?
Yeah.
Especially because stannous fluoride was already being used by Procter and Gamble. So if you're a competitor and you
Okay.
may not even have access to that stannous fluoride salt because there may be an exclusive agreement that restricts it. So then you have to start looking for other forms of fluoride. So all of a sudden, the sodium monofluorophosphate comes around.
Okay. So
And
that's then a
that was the
possible
possible way.
solution
Exactly.
for the abrasives into. So it's almost like the next generation of problems. So it's a
Yes.
possible solution to now we're dealing with abrasives in toothpaste.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it, actually. Mind you, the high quality again and the abrasive, they weren't available yet. I think only in the late 60s was there maybe a patent issued for a new type of silica. But again, it was going to be synthesized. It was going to have limited, anytime, you have these patents and stuff and you have these inventions or innovations, these methods to make things, again, the industry has to catch up. So are you
Makes
ready
sense.
to handle the
Yeah.
volume or is there going to be time involved then in the scale up? Usually that's what your chemical engineers and stuff are usually brought in for, right?
Makes
So you
sense.
have your scientists in the lab working on something, then you convene with the engineers and then they have to try to figure out, well, how do you scale this? How do you again meet a huge demand for it?
That's
So
sometimes the feasibility of manufacturing
that's the
then.
feasibility. Yeah. It
Okay.
all it all goes into that. So unless it's going to be an economical kind of approach, or if you can't, think that, okay, maybe we can earn our money back maybe in 5 years, then maybe you don't want to go down that pathway. It might just be too expensive. So
Okay.
that's right.
The original form, though,
Yep.
of clinically proven fluoride in toothpaste,
Yes.
like the kind that would sit on the shelf that you can buy and take
Yes.
home, was stannous fluoride.
Yep.
And then Procter and Gamble then introduced that in the mid 1950s, right?
Exactly. Based on the
Okay.
research from IU and Mueller and all that stuff that we discussed, previously. Yep.
Okay. So I imagine the other companies like Colgate, as in today, people want to do,
Absolutely.
they're going to want to differentiate their fluoride format like sodium
Exactly. And
monofluorophosphate.
so there was strong
Okay.
interest to differentiate that, mostly for marketing purposes, right? But
Mm,
Colgate is perhaps the most recognizable name associated with sodium monofluorophosphate use here in the US. There's other brands outside the US like Unilever that might be well known too. But I believe that Colgate introduced it in the late 60s, maybe 1968 if I can remember.
okay. So about a decade then after
Yeah,
P&G
that's right.
introduced the stannous fluoride. So this would be when calcium carbonate, for example, was still used as a common abrasive in toothpaste.
Exactly. So you either have a heat treated calcium phosphate, or you would have a calcium carbonate, or you would use alumina, something like that. That's right. Just to be absolutely clear, then MFP was found to be compatible with calcium carbonate abrasive systems. And that's why even to this day, you will find MFP and calcium carbonate.
Okay,
Those are excellent partners. That
makes
is a
sense.
system that works. Unilever does this, I think, in India, especially. They have a lot of formulations there,
Okay.
but you still can find the products by Colgate here in the US if you wanted to.
Okay, but to be clear, sodium MFP isn't naturally found,
Yeah,
right?
it's not, but this is kind of interesting. So it does have to be synthesized, but depending on the definition of natural and
We
what
talked
it
about this
and who you
before.
want to get that certification of that natural label, it can be considered natural. For instance, the Natural Products Association, NPA, regards this MFP or even sodium fluoride to be natural, provided, you have to share them the source information, the
Hmm.
paperwork and such. But yeah, that's just how it is. But maybe another association might not. Depends on how much work goes into making it natural or whatever.
Okay, so you mentioned the quote unquote natural
Yeah.
definition of an ingredient, such as one example would be like hydroxyapatite,
Yep.
can be quite broad and critically depends on the criteria from
Yes.
the basically what you're saying is the issuing association.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so if sodium monofluorophosphate isn't natural, then how's it made?
Well, it comes from a natural fluoride source. And
Okay,
that
that's
fluoride,
encouraging.
yeah, that's encouraging. And that's really the reason why they even
Okay, that makes
get this,
sense.
as long as it's from the natural source. So the
Okay,
fluorspar. So fluorspar is really the mineral name. Chemically, you would, refer to that as calcium fluoride.
okay, okay. So because it might be used as a natural source fluoride in creation of the
Yes.
sodium MFP or sodium fluoride,
Yes.
even that really contributes strongly to the definition of
Yes.
natural, which makes
Absolutely.
me feel comfortable. I actually can understand that.
Yeah, that's right. So natural, nature derived, nature equivalent, nature inspired, whatever.
Okay,
There's
so
Yep.
fluorspar is the source. Then what?
So here's where it gets interesting. So sodium fluoride is first created from fluorspar. So you have calcium fluoride
Okay.
bonds, and those are pretty much insoluble. So you have to use a strong acid to cleave that bond, to hydrolyze that bond, if we want to go back to our new word
Okay.
that we learned,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So you would use, for instance, hydrofluoric acid that can cleave that bond. Sometimes you can also use hydrochloric acid too, concentrated,
Okay.
hydrochloric acid. But because it is so acidic, then you're going to have to neutralize that. So if you have a little bit of calcium fluoride powder and you put it in a hydrofluoric acid, liquid, right? It's going to dissolve, it'll become soluble, but it's very acidic. So in order to be able to work with it, you have to neutralize it. And so you would
Okay.
use a strong base. A very easy, traditional, typical, standard strong base is sodium hydroxide.
Okay.
So the sodium from the sodium hydroxide and the fluoride from the calcium fluoride that is now has been cleaved that can precipitate out sodium fluoride salt.
What is sodium fluoride react with to then produce the sodium monofluorophosphate?
Yeah, so and this is really the crux of the novelty. So a
Okay.
pyrophosphate is used, a metaphosphate actually, sodium PO3. So, typically if you were to use like a hexametaphosphate and some of these other things, those are really just chains of the sodium PO3 molecule. It is considered a type of pyrophosphate. It can be considered to be a polymer of phosphate. It's kind of
Okay.
interesting. We don't usually talk about that.
Mm-mm.
Usually polymers people think of in terms of carbon based, like polyethylene
Mm-hmm.
oxide or polypropylene, things like this. Especially like with the poloxamers, right? Those are made of polymers, right? But here you can do that with some phosphate salts. And these salts are readily soluble and they're very acidic. But you don't do that here. You would use one of these metaphosphate salts, don't add any water, and add in same equal molar concentration of the sodium fluoride. So if you have sodium fluoride salt and you have the metaphosphate salt, you put them in a crucible and you heat them, for instance, at 900 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. And that process is usually called a pyrolyzing,
We're
process,
learning a
but
lot today. I like it.
it's a heat treatment, but there is no water involved, no solutions involved. You get this fusion of these molten salts that then produce the sodium monofluorophosphate.
Okay, so that's really cool. A water-free process. So who discovered that? Who
Well,
created that
yeah, I
process?
know, right? You see, yeah. So this is where it gets kind of interesting, and a little bit, I'm going to throw some shade here. Wikipedia is wrong, and I know anybody can update that, and I'll go to those
Mhm.
records, and AI is wrong.
Shocking.
They do have some important, insights into that, but there's more to it. And so there was a German immigrant, and he was a chemist, Dr. Willy Lange, if I'm pronouncing that right, of course. And he's often credited with creating sodium monofluorophosphate. So that's what the AI tool will give you and like Wikipedia give you. But that's not actually what was the commercialized version because the yields in his process were way too low and it was too impure. So the poor yields and way too impure. Do you really have something that you can really be credited to? Probably not. The scientist, some say, maybe he worked at Procter and Gamble for a bit, but he was definitely at the University of Cincinnati. And the whole reason why this salt actually made it into the dentifrice market is from a different scientist called Carl Landerson. That's what his name was. And he's from the Ozark Mahoning Chemical Company that's based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Anderson became connected to this Dr. Lange from a mutual connection that they shared at Purdue University. Yeah. And so, although he originally worked with the fluorophosphoric acids, this Dr. Lange, I mean, in fact, he even published in 1927, and he originally thought that sodium monofluorophosphate, if it was going to be created, might have use for mothballing or moth proofing, I should say. So it wasn't even for dentifrice applications. But again, like I said, the yields were too low. And so Anderson thought about it and said, why don't we just heat treat this? These two salt forms will have a fusion process. Boom. And it worked. And you could find those details in his 1949 US patent that was issued. And he had high yields and it was good purity too, among the highest. Now, always remember, even to this day, if somebody even has sodium fluoride salt, sodium monofluorophosphate salt, and they want to put that in a toothpaste or whatever, and they look for sources, there could still be some sodium fluoride impurity, maybe up to a couple, of a tenths of a percent. So maybe 0.2 or 0.3% might still be in the form of sodium fluoride because maybe not all of that sodium fluoride is reacted in the fusion process.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. It doesn't sound like a negative, though.
No,
that
it's not
makes
a
sense.
negative.
Okay.
That's just what it is.
Okay. So you mentioned Purdue University.
I know.
That's like another Indiana connection. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. And actually, the scientists at Ozark didn't even meet any of the dentists that were going to be really driving the research into, well, what is the safety and efficacy levels clinically for dentists until they met. And the guy who is principally known for that is a Dr. Hodge. He didn't meet the Ozark personnel until 1950, until there was a IADR conference, and it was held in French Lick, Indiana.
Okay, the world is a small, small place. I do love the history of it, though. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and so the Ozark Mahoning Company, they had Anderson had a process. And Mr. Anderson did, of course. And now they had to shop it around. So got the patent on it in 1949. Now you got to try to shop this thing around. So that required a lot of travel from them going to different countries outside the U.S.
Interesting. So you said shopping around. Is this where Colgate comes in?
Yes and no. So Colgate definitely popularized it. Again, they even had a trademark to the MFP. Like you couldn't use sodium MFP, that acronym without having a registered mark next to it. That's what they protected. But it didn't start with them.
Then who?
It was a company in Hong Kong. It was called Hawley and Hazel Company. And this was in the early 60s. I think it was around 1963 when they first used it in a toothpaste.
No
MFP.
way.
Yeah, but by 63, they already had so many requests coming in from Europe, especially from manufacturers, dentifrice manufacturers, as well as researchers.
So it was getting popular.
Yeah, so it was getting popular, and they expected, and the demand was going to reach about 90,000 tons of this MFP salt. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So that's 45 tons. That's a ton.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's a lot.
Okay, so for a reference, how much of this sodium MFP do you actually use in a toothpaste?
Yeah, so the OTC monograph for Carey stipulates that it's around 0.76%. It can fluctuate a little bit because that level is based on volume.
Okay.
And it's based because these formulations have different densities. That's why you get that.
That makes sense.
But it hovers right around there.
Let's just fair to say it's less than 1%. And there were orders for 45 tons in the early 1960s.
Yeah, in the 1960s, the Ozark Mahoning Company, they had also been commercializing the stannous fluoride as well at commercial scale. So they also had a hand in that too. So I think it was just easy for them to get with.
So they were ready, very well positioned to supply the dentifrice market.
Absolutely.
Is what it sounds like. Okay.
So Colgate, so they had MFP, they launched it in 68, and I hope that that then makes sense why the timeline makes sense. You
It's
couldn't,
starting to,
yeah, you
yeah.
couldn't put sodium fluoride in toothpaste because the abrasives wouldn't
Right.
allow it. And now you have an MFP that was being able to be made at an economical, scale
And enough purity.
at enough purity that all of a sudden that was making the mark and that was going to differentiate then from the stannous fluoride that was already on the market. So that's why you have more clinical trials on toothpaste that were done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
That makes sense. But then
Yep.
sodium fluoride becomes really popular,
Yeah,
right?
it
Because
does. Yep.
that's when the new era sort of gets ushered in.
Yeah, that's right. And so, sodium fluoride wanted to get used. MFP, like we said, it still has a market worldwide, not big in the US, but it does have a bigger footprint. Usually Unilever is the one driving that.
Okay.
The company likes to have, that formulation. And yes, it has calcium carbonate as the abrasive.
Okay. Okay. So sodium fluoride was used, and then stannous fluoride was used again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm trying to keep up.
Yep. No, that's right. So there was a return to stannous fluoride. This was marked in the mid 1990s, right? And mind you, there were some other innovations in this time. So we immediately go from sodium monofluorophosphate to sodium fluoride and then back to stannous fluoride. So it begs the question, where was sodium fluoride in the middle of this? It's because you could add other ingredients to the sodium fluoride. Maybe you could add some zinc salts. Maybe you could add triclosan. That was another thing that
Oh,
Colgate
yeah.
did and put that in their toothpaste. Maybe you might have some anti-calculus agents, some pyrophosphates.
Okay.
And they were having really good success. You were starting to have some better polymers that were coming out that would improve some of the surfactant, fluoride, and abrasive properties whenever it was used clinically. So there were some innovations that were coming out that were trying to make this better. And of course, you had non-calcium and non-reactive abrasives being also produced, like the silicas. And all this other stuff came down to cost then. Is sodium fluoride cheaper to
Okay.
produce? Yes. Are the silicas a little bit more, I don't know, are they more ordered, right? Is it more systematic? Can you get that at a cost effective?
The
Yeah,
consistency.
everything is just a little bit better, And again, it's a little bit different. If everybody's using calcium carbonate
Right.
abrasives, well, you want to use something different. So then it's
Yes.
not just a fluoride salt
Yes.
question. It's like, well, we have this awesome new abrasive system that can give you better polish, better clean.
The marketing spin.
So that's what happened. And sodium fluoride was then used because it gave you the best overall results when mixed with these other newer high-tech
Okay.
ingredients. But then you have to differentiate. And so hence again, all of a sudden there was discovery, hey, maybe stannous fluoride could have another benefit, not just caries related.
This is where they might have the anti-gingivitis.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Okay.
during this period of time, you had other pending monographs that are now still going on for like anti-plaque, anti-gingivitis. You had some different combinations. Like this is where you had Listerine essential oils. You had
Okay.
cetylpyridinium chloride, and then also started to get some data on stannous fluoride. And that's why stannous fluoride is also in that monograph. All of a sudden,
Okay.
more clinical studies started coming back because they were like, well, maybe it has a benefit. We're noticing that when people use stannous fluoride, maybe their gum tissue looked healthier. And so
Okay.
you start doing, again, it all comes down to marketing. How are you going to differentiate? But the return to stannous fluoride is to say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there was another benefit we really weren't driving attention to. We had caries, we knew that.
Right.
But what about gingivitis? And so that's where that came. But you have to be able to formulate stannous fluoride formulations correctly. And stannous fluoride is a tricky one. So that's a big if. Nowadays, the manufacturers that are involved in it, they know how to do this to a very high degree. And we'll talk about that in another segment because there's some really neat, approaches for the stannous. But the stannous part is the part that drives the anti-gingivitis benefit, but is so temperamental.
Okay.
So you
Formulation
Yeah,
is
formulation. You either had to keep it
okay.
at a very low pH, or you had to have a water-free system, or you had to have chelators present in order to prevent premature oxidation, which affects, a lot of formulations of stannous. It can. It doesn't do that.
So I see a lot of
Just-
commercials or ads for
Yeah, that's
Sensodyne.
right.
For example, the indicating toothpaste with stannous fluoride might also have sensitivity
Yes.
benefits.
So this is yet another beast coming out. So the tentative
Okay.
monograph, yeah. So there really isn't anything specific to stannous fluoride in the monograph for hypersensitivity,
Even though it's been around.
even though it's been around.
Okay.
Well, actually, all of the three fluoride salts would be classified as like maybe a tier 3 in the hypersensitivity monograph, meaning there might be some benefits, but
Okay.
we don't know. More testing is recommended. And if you do have testing, hold that on file, make sure it's a good evaluation. You might be able to use that, but you need to be able to produce that
Okay.
evidence if called upon. And so for those companies that do include the anti-sensitivity active
Hmm.
ingredient benefit with anti-caries and anti-gingivitis for the stannous fluoride, you can bet that they have at least not one, but two well-designed clinical trials. And so they have that in their dossier for their product. They may not publicly disclose that all the time in the results,
Hmm.
but if called to ask from the FDA or FTC or
Hmm.
whoever, or the NAD, which we've already been discussing,
Right.
they will have to produce that. And so it's kind of interesting. And I think right now, the stannous fluoride is the only one that can get all those three primary indications. And so who wouldn't want that?
Absolutely.
But you have to be able to formulate it correctly and without infringing existing technology that makes stannous be effective.
You've talked about that before, and that's quite tricky.
Yeah.
Okay. So there does seem to be big differences among these fluoride salts.
Yes.
So you mentioned sodium fluoride likely has some advantages over sodium monofluorophosphate
Yes.
with respects to caries reduction specifically.
Yes.
So what other differentiations?
Well, now we talk about assays, right? Because we want to know some quantitative differences.
Okay, yeah.
What can we point to say, hey, look, this product is delivering fluoride or has a better benefit without having to run a full clinical trial? And so the OTC carries monograph actually stipulates two different types of tests. One of the tests that you could do, and these are lab-based tests. So this is nice. It's cheaper
Yeah.
than running a clinical
Lab
study,
always cheaper, yeah.
and one of them is called the enamel fluoride uptake test. Now, sodium fluoride is a rock star in this test, but that also means that if you add other ingredients to a sodium fluoride, formulation,
Hmm.
there is a risk that the fluoride uptake might be compromised. So all of that has to go into the thought process of what kind of fluoride toothpaste do you want? What ingredients do you want? What kind of marketing do you want? All of this. It all goes
It's
together.
starting to make a lot more
Yeah.
sense.
And so, like, for instance, if you put a zinc salt into a, sodium fluoride silica based toothpaste, the fluoride uptake that you would get might not be good. If you put a pyrophosphate in, that could be encumbered as well. Ooh, if you put calcium compounds, it might be increased or decreased. The fluoride uptake depends on the nature of the calcium compound that you're putting in there. I'm not talking about an abrasive like calcium
Right.
carbonate, but some people use other calcium technologies to maybe help improve
It sounds temperamental.
the anti-caries. It is. And so these types of tools are used in the formulation activities as part of the R&D of a formulation.
To try to make sure it's effective.
Yeah, not only effective, but then also this can also give you insight on the availability also of the fluoride that you have in a formulation.
Okay, so help me understand why fluoride uptake would be important. Like, what does that mean?
So that would mean that you have fluoride present in the formulation and
Hmm.
it's easily able to get to the teeth,
So it's
which is
free to
the
integrate.
yeah, so that's the caries benefit that it
Okay.
has. So you can imagine if you have a sodium fluoride formulation where the fluoride isn't so free, do you think you'd have lower fluoride uptake into the teeth?
Absolutely. If there's
Ex-
not as much free to interact or integrate.
exactly. And the
Okay.
monograph stipulates that you need to have a certain level of free fluoride. I think the minimum for sodium fluoride would be like 650. That's one of the evaluations. You have to do the enamel fluoride uptake is one of the two evaluations that you can choose from to do, but you have to do it.
Have to.
Yeah, have to. Yep.
Okay. So you say have to. That's why I repeated it a couple times. I'm sure that the newer brands aren't really conducting these tests.
No, they're not. And in fact, we've even ran studies just on fluoride
I thought.
availability alone. And, some of these companies will do that. No, they don't. So if you have different products in the marketplace and where you're getting these, and these they might even be professional dental products. They could be over the counter. They could be made by dentists. They could be made by just pure marketing, companies that are just wanting to do
Right.
this. If they haven't been made properly,
Hmm.
there's a risk that if you combine certain ingredients with the sodium fluoride formulation, that you're going to have reduced availability and then therefore reduced efficacy. And you have to be at least as good as the ADA reference standard,
Okay.
and which is also the ISO standard. And, that's a special toothpaste, if anybody, is even interested. I mean, I think it costs about $500 for this type of toothpaste. You got to keep it cool and everything else. But that's what the
Okay.
manufacturers use whenever they do these tests before they go to market,
So they use it
to
as a
make
metric,
sure
a testing
it's a
metric.
metric.
Okay.
It has to be at least as good as.
Okay.
you have to do that. I bet you there's so many people listening that do not even know that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of them that don't even know that you have to do a fluoride uptake test, but it
okay.
is what it is.
So
That's why
basically,
we're doing this.
yeah, what we're talking about then is the free quote unquote fluoride, making sure it's available
Yes.
for that integration for so it can be efficacious for your teeth.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Now, if stannous fluoride toothpaste was evaluated,
Yes.
would you use then the enamel fluoride uptake?
No, you wouldn't actually. I mean,
Okay.
you can, but a sodium fluoride is generally going to beat a stannous fluoride in that assay
That
because
particular one. Okay.
that assay is all about the fluoride. But as we know, the stannous fluoride, it's not only about the fluoride, is it?
I'm guessing no.
No, it's the stannous part. And so there was
Yes.
another assay that actually predated the enamel fluoride uptake assay, and it's called the enamel solubility reduction test.
Okay.
And that one was specifically designed for these different salts, like a stannous salt. I mean, they would also use this when they were screening for different fluoride salts, like they used this for like lead fluoride. Although you never want to put that in your teeth. Trust me, they did, screen for this. A little bit silly, I think, but you have to know where the benefits may or may not be.
Fair enough. Fair
Sometimes
enough.
you'd have like, some, I don't know. Anyway, but there was a lot of metal based, like heavier metals, not your
Okay.
sodiums or your potassiums, but your titanium or your stannous
Okay.
or your obviously,
Okay.
lead,
So you talked
things like
about
that.
enamel solubility reduction. So what is, or describe what's that evaluation for? How's it work?
So in general, anytime a fluoride is taken into the tooth, there should be some measure of resistant to acids. Full stop. It's going to
Okay.
be why and how by virtue of the fluorapatite that is created alone. So fluorapatite is harder to dissolve than hydroxyapatite.
See,
So
everything that you've said before is really coming into light.
yeah, but now there's a next level protection where it's not just fluorapatite, it's wow, what happens if you have stannous here present?
Okay.
Because the structure isn't exactly simple as it's fluorapatite. You start getting some of these hybrid structures, hybrid minerals that are introduced into the teeth and they help actually inhibit even further demineralization. So you have
Okay.
hydroxyapatite, then you have fluorapatite, and the next level protection is stannous fluoride based apatite.
Okay.
Okay. And it's not necessarily that you have stannous necessarily getting put into the tooth structure, although that could happen. There have been x-ray results that show that compositionally that does occur or can occur.
Okay.
But it's about the way that the stannous may be hanging on to the surface of the enamel. It
The
might be very
beauty of it.
superficial. Yeah. It might just be holding the phosphate there better, the calcium there, and the fluoride better to the tooth. This is also why sometimes you'll see an indication written on the toothpaste tube of a stannous fluoride toothpaste that says this product may cause staining. But that
Okay.
staining is impermanent and can be relieved from the tooth either with a dental cleaning, whenever that is, or through use of other non staining toothpaste. But if you were to use a stannous fluoride toothpaste, and there's a lot of them now, a lot of great options, they could counter some of that staining by putting in a pyrophosphate.
There's so
So
many tricks.
so there's a lot of tricks. Yeah, these are very deep questions. Don't seem like that they are, but in the
There's a lot
design
involved.
of a toothpaste, you have to think about first of all, do you want it to have fluoride or not? And then if you do, which of the three fluoride salts that you
What are
want?
you
And
trying to
then you
achieve?
have to know about your claims and you have to know about your risks too, because
Right.
like staining and stuff. Or wow, if I'm gonna be using a stannous fluoride, do I use the enamel fluoride uptake assay to evaluate, or would I use the enamel solubility reduction?
Okay.
You would use the ESR as it's known
Okay.
instead of the EFU. Do you know how many manufacturers and scientists both do not know that?
I
And so
believe that.
sometimes you would have, so you might have a great product. We're talking about the brands or the dentist, whoever, but they may not have tested it the right way.
Well, if you use the wrong
So
model, it probably won't shine as
yeah,
much as what you're saying, right?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And so, and,
Okay.
and to be brutally honest here, the FDA doesn't necessarily make all this very easy and clear in the monograph. So even if somebody were to say, well, I knew this, no, it's just not there. Yeah.
What I'm hearing you say is stannous fluoride significantly improves
Yes.
resistance to acids.
Even better than fluorapatite, alone. That's
Okay.
right. Yep.
And then would you say that this is also then general stannous fluoride is generally better at that than the sodium fluoride and the sodium
Oh yeah,
MFP?
absolutely. In that essay all day long. In fact,
Okay.
you don't even have to get better results or superior results with just the fluoride alone. This is one of the reasons why manufacturers or innovators, R&D, research scientists and stuff, they'll try to put in other ingredients to try to meet an improved level of either acid resistance or enamel fluoride uptake. So there's different ways to do this. In fact, for as long as I can remember, it's been this way. In the historical record, it's this way. This continues to be and will always be a hot
Wow.
topic. How do you protect the teeth strongly enough? And in our prior episodes, we're starting to talk about polypeptides, right? Or the different peptide action. There's different approaches that can be used.
The
And
strategy
the
seemed
strategy,
really interesting.
yes, these are high interest R&D topics. Absolutely.
I'm guessing the average person has no idea about the differences of these products. I will say I did not know the differences of these products of which is better, which isn't.
Sure.
So this is quite interesting and it's useful because the use of these products seems targeted. In other words, if you have sensitivity, then you're definitely going to want to focus on a sensitivity-based toothpaste, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And you bring up a great point because it really does truly depend on why you are using a given product.
Okay.
These are going to be aspects that we'll talk about in a future episode just because we're out of time
It
now.
seems basic, but
Yeah, but it seems basic because I just want to use toothpaste. Well, why? I just want to clean my, well, could be some other issues.
Okay.
And we talk to a lot of people. We get emails and we get comments. And of course, we just have our normal, interactions
Right.
with just anybody on a daily basis. And it's absolutely fascinating what people know or don't know and why they choose to use a product.
yeah, the
I mean,
answers they give are very
it's really interesting. And it's interesting from our point of view because we know this stuff. Like, I know these nuances. The
You
typical
definitely
person
do.
asking this question do not know the nuances. They
Right.
haven't formulated all these different
Right.
toothpastes or different products. They're not familiar with
Mm-hmm.
the tests. And so this is not a normal thing. So it is for us. We understand some of these differences and we'll talk about those in a future episode. But
which would be great.
which would be great. Yeah. Maybe it'll be the next episode. We'll see. But
Cool.
before we go, I want to speak to a late breaking paper that just got published in November 2025
Okay.
in Science Advances. And we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the podcast where we're talking about water fluoridation. And there's,
yes.
obviously it's a hot topic here in the US as well as outside the US. Everybody's worried, oh, you're going to get cognitive impairment. No, you're not if you use the right fluoride level. Well, this paper just published, and it was many different researchers. Some are at University of Wisconsin, others are at Columbia University, some of them are at the National Institutes of Health. Anyway, this is a retrospective study. They just went through all of this other data where they were trying to look at the data that they had for people that were in high school here in the US, all the way up to the age of 60, that maybe they had some IQ information, some data on. We're talking about written skills, mathematical skills, verbal skills.
Cognition.
Yeah, and they were trying to map that to where areas that they might have been and whether they had been maybe exposed to fluoride.
I want to know.
Yeah, so in the end, and the authors were very good. Why is this being challenged so much? We don't know. And they even say the same thing. The people coming out challenging fluoride in water, they're using research based on the levels of fluoride found in water that do not exist in the US.
International levels.
International levels that are already damaging potentially and or at risk of fluorosis, and they even say that. So
that's clearly monitored or regulated.
Yeah. Now, we did mention the one paper coming out of Australia, they said, no, there's no evidence of any impairment at all. And it was a much better longitudinal study. And I think they had over 20 years of data associated with that, all in one region. It wasn't like they were trying to cherry pick, well, in this city or in this specific region of this country. No, it was country,
it was well done.
wide, and it was in Australia. That was a well done study. Here, this one, they looked at a lot of different participants who actually had this cognitive data. They had the levels of fluoride that were going to be in that area, and they associated it with, okay, for those that had no fluoride exposure, maybe some that had some fluoride exposure, and those that had a lot of fluoride exposure.
Okay.
Not in terms of dosing, but over the course of your life, did you always live in a water fluoridated environment?
Sense.
That's what we're talking about. And again, in the US, all the levels of fluoride in the water, if you have community water, are safe.
And highly regulated.
Yeah, remember, and highly regulated. Now, if you're going to be independent and be, a doomsdayer, have your bunker and stuff, you might drill your own well, you would likely, potentially, where you live,
have way more fluoride
in your water supply than you would if you had the community water,
And just for a reminder, what is the regulated level of?
it's less than 1. I think it was set lower to the point 0.9. I think it was even 0.7.
That's the number 6 in my head. So
But there's still communities in certain states, and maybe statewide, but there is some resistance, even if it might be a statewide ban, or there are communities in states that have said no, we don't want to put fluoride in the drinking water. Anyway, the outcome of this result was people don't get impaired, and you might actually have improvements in your cognitive abilities. Yes, even if you're
no.
partially or even exposed to a safe level in the drinking water. Yes, it
So I have to
absolutely,
make sure
it
that
absolutely,
I understand correctly. So great study
Yes.
just came out
Great study.
over a long period of time.
yes,
And because I want to make sure I understand correctly, if you're exposed to safe levels of fluoride in your
Yes.
drinking water,
Yeah.
you actually could have improved cognition.
yeah. I mean, here's a statement. It's even from their abstract alone. If you just want to go there, we find that children exposed to recommended levels of fluoride in drinking water exhibit modestly better cognition in secondary school. So your high school,
There's your answer.
an advantage that is smaller and no longer statistically significant by the time you get to the age of 60 years old.
Yeah. So I'll take any advantage of I can get. So
And you needed it then
Yeah,
at that point
exactly.
anyway. And remember, even in a couple of episodes back, we even talked about the third gender, right? We talked
Yes.
about the aging stuff, and especially as you go above age, the age of 60, all of a
Yes.
sudden you're having microbiological properties
Absolutely.
that aren't necessarily aligned with female
That's a
or
great point.
male, and it's kind of an interesting point. So anyway, so
Thank
this
you
is
for sharing. That's
this is
awesome.
late breaking. It kind of goes with some other stuff, and I just think it's really important. I mean, these authors were very clear in saying we have to have additional data out there that speak to the normalcy. What is the U.S. already
What was
doing?
the journal this was published in again?
Science Advances.
Fantastic.
Science Advances. It's in November 2025. The lead author on this is John Robert Warren.
Fabulous.
So there you go. So I think that's kind of nice that we can actually come back we have to go all the way back to like episode 2, I think, or 3 for the water fluoridation.
Right, right.
Where we talked about that. But, it's really nice that we see this
It
kind of data.
continues to confirm.
Continues to move. So no, it's not going to make you nuts. Now, again, if you have unsafe levels, and again,
As with anything.
speaking of that, I mentioned that Dr. Hodge here that had been introduced to the guys from Ozark Mahoney in French Lick, Indiana in 1950, and he was the one that did some of that initial studies with sodium monofluorophosphate. Again, he was the one who actually published in the Journal of the American Dental Association. And it could have been, I think it was either late, I don't remember the dates. It could have been in the early 50s, maybe. The link of caries protection versus fluorosis. And there was a nexus point where if you get to that point, you have minimal fluorosis and maximal reduction of caries incidence.
So it's no.
So
The
it has
optimal
been,
level.
and it was the same guy
Perfect.
that was involved in some of those assessments, as well as for this, different form of fluoride that
That's
was used.
exciting.
So yeah, so it's kind of neat. It all ties in. So there you go. And so with that, well, we leave you. So thank you for listening. You can always feel free to reach out with questions, as people have been doing, and it's been really helpful because again, now we know where some interest could be. From that point of view, but please continue to do so. Again, I'm Dr. Rob. This is Tami. Stay curious and keep smiling. Thank you.